Welcome everyone to Money Talks. This talk series is in sync with the invitation for Money Stories and also for the writing program, a 6 weeks workshop with ladies first as the story prompt. Please visit www.tellmeyourstory.biz for more. It is our privilege to have Professor Nandini Bhattacharya as our esteemed guest today. Nandini Bhattacharya is a writer and professor of English at Texas A&M University. Her fields of expertise are South Asia studies, Indian cinema, post-colonial studies, colonial discourse analysis, women's studies, and creative writing. She has published 3 scholarly books on these subjects, and the latest being Hindi cinema, repeating the subject. Her first novel, Love's Garden, was published in October 2020. Shorter work is published in Oyster River Pages, Sky Island Journal, and Saturday Evening Post. Best Short Stories from the Great American Fiction Contest Anthology 2021. The Bangalore Review, the Bombay Review, and more. She has attended the Bread Loaf Writers Workshop and been accepted for residencies at the Vermont Studio Center and VONA. Her awards include first runner-up for the Los Angeles Review Flash Fiction Contest 2017 to 2018, and honorable mention for the Saturday Evening Post Great American Stories Contest 2021. She is currently working on her Homeland Blues, her second novel about love, caste, colorism, and violent religious fundamentalism in India, and racism and xenophobia in post-Donald Trump America. And I'm Insha Faridoon, a student and project lead for Money Stories, taking forward the conversation along with Koral Dasgupta, author and founder of www.tellmeyourstory.biz.
Insha, why don't you go ahead with your questions first, after which I will come on board with Nandini.
Sure.
Nandini, welcome to the show, and we are very glad to have you with us.
And it's an honor and a privilege. Thank you so much for inviting me.
My pleasure. Insha, please go ahead.
Yes. So the first question I wanted to ask was about your book, Love's Garden.
Mm-hmm.
In your book, the main character gets remarried in order to be saved from one of the unjust shame and helplessness of widowhood in medieval Indian society. How would you say that stigma has changed in today's society? Are women nowadays more financially stable after divorces or widowhood?
It really depends on the class, doesn't it? Because if it's someone with some education and marketable work skills, yes. But as we know, the majority of India is below the poverty level, or a large part of it is below the poverty level, and of course, women are always the disproportionately more affected members of any such family unit. So in the case of my protagonist, or rather my character in Love's Garden, the woman that you're referring to, she was a member of a landed gentry kind of social class, and of course had no education. People in that group, women in that group, and actually even men wouldn't have had much education at all, and not very many work opportunities, as she would be too much of a higher class to be working in the fields. But on the other hand, she would have had no other other skills. So I would say that even today, the same kind of intersectionality works for women in India, whether or not you are able to survive I think the still ongoing stigma of widowhood depends on what your social class is and what your family background is, and to some extent how tolerant or liberal your folks are. So
yeah, you're absolutely right. And also, another question I had was, is the protagonist frame story inspired by any real life event or character or situation?
Yes, I get asked that a lot, because it probably is palpable that I am very close to this character. I haven't based her on any specific historical person, that either I know of or is a member of my family. But I would say she's a sort of composite figure of many women that I had heard about in my family, through stories, and also somewhat my reading, my historical and my literary reading about what was possible and what was not possible for women, like my character in 20th century, in early 20th century India. So I would say she is and she is not based on anyone real, but like more like a possible type. Yeah.
So she's an amalgamation of a lot of people you might have known, a lot of characters, basically.
Yeah. Like I said, some of it is really derived from stories I've heard about what I would call foremothers in my family. But again, also some of it is just imagined, and you have the storyteller's license. You go wherever you want to with the little bit of fact that you have, and that's what I did.
Yes. And also, the third question I had was, there is often a lack of strong and well written, complex female characters in literature and other modern media. And your book has a lot of well written, complex female characters who often have healthy relationships with each other, in contrast to most media where women are often pitted against each other. So, was this a conscious decision on your part?
Yeah, very much. I had another thing to say about something you said, but my whole theme in the story is the kind of loyalty and bond that women have with each other in spite of being in patriarchy. And patriarchy is very real, and it is very daunting, and it can be very vicious. So what I was trying to show in the novel was that such friendships among or between women have existed in the past, that they have been one of the ways in which women have survived the conditions in which they have found themselves, and that this is not something that we need to despair about, that these kinds of relationships and friendships between women are entirely possible. And in fact, they're highly sustaining of women. And so, I really wanted to foreground that message that women can support each other. Women can be there for each other, in spite of the fact that, as in my novel, many things come in the way of their doing that. Many things tend to separate women and make them see more benefit in supporting the men in their lives, but they don't. They stand up for their own gender. So that's something I definitely. I mean, I almost feel like that's a little bit doctrinaire, like it was a little ideological on my part to really stress that message, but I did want to stress.
Yes, and I absolutely love that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Insha. I will take Nandini through the next set of questions. Nandini, I really wanted to ask you that there is a huge body of work that you have with or without this book. And my something that I really wanted to know was that going through those different levels of studies, you are a professor of women's studies as well. Did your academic pursuits help you in putting this story together? And if yes, how?
Oh, very much. I don't think I could have had sort of the plot lines or the material for creating a world where, Saroj is born and is, for instance, affected by the Widow Remarriage Act. That's something that absolutely came out of my research and my, my scholarship about the period, about women in India, about the laws that were passed from the 19th century and right on up to 1956, when there was the personal laws that were passed in India for various religious groups that also tremendously affected women, actually, and in differential ways, not in the same way as men were affected. So definitely my scholarship has played a very large role in creating this imaginary world. Yeah, without that, I don't think I would have had this novel, in fact, and or had the ideas for the novel. Yeah, so that's the sort of brief, short answer to the question. That's a great question.
Thank you so much. So, when I hear from you the term widow, I know for sure that this is not just a term which you have used in terms of personal loss. This term can be highly political.
Yeah.
Would you like to talk a little bit about that with reference to the period that the story
Yeah.
covers?
Yeah. So I assume what you mean is what is the political status of a widow in at different points of time, and definitely, as I mentioned, there was this law passed called the Widow Remarriage Act in, I believe it was in 1876, and of course it was passed by the British. And it was considered or was proclaimed to be a very woman-friendly act because, widows were in this sort of gray land or in this gray area, in this liminal status once they were widowed, where they had no social status, they had no economic abilities, they were very much outcasts and placed at the very fringes of society, basically waiting for them to die, or had to undergo many other kinds of social challenges. I mean, our great writers Tagore and others have written about these kinds of fates that befell women, particularly Chokher Bali, as I'm sure you know the novel, but others also. And what I wanted to have come across in the novel is that the laws and policies that are sometimes made and are considered to be women friendly, in fact, have nothing to do with women, have everything to do with the advantages of men in their lives, or men who control the destinies of the women that they supposedly are legislating for. But if we go even further back, as most of us will know if we know something about Indian history, there is also, of course, the banning of the Sati Act, which I believe happened in 1833 or 1838 under William Bentinck during the colonial period. But again, that was something that remained controversial. And again, Bentinck didn't pass that to help, the women of India. He passed it so as to appease a certain segment of the Indian male, the population, the patriarchy. So most of the things that historically seem to have been done, and there are exceptions, of course, but most of them, the reforms that have been seen as, woman-friendly reforms have often had very little to do with the actual consent or engagement of women in the passing of those laws, or with the outcomes, and particularly financial outcomes. So because the topic of our session is money, I just want to add that the Widow Remarriage Act was really passed because landowners didn't want the money in their family to pass into other hands. For instance, if a widow remarried another, or if a widow claimed her right to have her husband's share of the money, it would be a big fight no matter, because the laws were not set up that way. But if she did so, she'd be alienating a part of the family property. And this was one of the reasons why older brothers or other male relatives of a deceased man would want to marry the widow of that man, so as to keep the property intact and to keep all the assets of the family together, and not always with the consent of the widow of the deceased man. So there you go, that sort of thing.
I think that kind of a situation exists even today, when women who are married, if they are looking, or if they even try to claim their father's property, when there are many siblings, men and women included, they are looked down upon and ridiculed, that how could they, and as if they are cheating upon the brother. So I think
And
exists.
there's definitely a scholarship on that. Even recently, a friend of, actually a college mate of mine, she wrote a scholarly book about this problem with inheritance, of Hindu women's inheritance, and as you said, how they are seen as, selfish or assertive, and all of those things, that women are aggressive, that women aren't supposed to be, if they claim their right to their patrimony as opposed to their brothers.
Nandini, I'll bring you back to this women's aspect. Before that, if I may take you a little further towards the era that we are talking about.
Sure.
India has always been a land of riches. It had great soil, it grew great spices, it had great
Textile.
textiles, yes, and it was rich in every way. And there had been many invasions, out of which the British was the most difficult part of our history. So, pre-colonialization, how do you see the Indian economy standing, and what changed post the British took over?
Yeah, and here's where I hesitate a little, because I'm not, an economist or an economic historian, but particularly from my understanding, I can say that it really was a reversal of a world order where, Europe really at that time was a poor, shivering, sort of supplicant economy that really needed the infusion of resources from other parts of the world, and very successfully did so. Which, whether one says that's the Western, this mindset or the spirit or whatever it is, or it was just a kind of cultural coincidence, or even basically aggression that allowed that to happen. But as we know, the envoy of the East India Company, Sir Thomas Roe, came to the court of Jahangir in, I believe, 1605 or something, and really was treated like, nothing, was treated like scum, and had to repeatedly make petitions and ask for trading privileges and trading permissions. And there are, accounts in his diaries of how frustrated and how angry he is about having to do this. And very, very interestingly, even at that time, Roe was pointing a finger at Jahangir's sister, at the woman we now know of as Noor Jahan. There are many accounts of who she is. Is she the wife? Is she the sister? But anyway, it's a powerful woman in the Mughal court who is kind of running things from behind the scenes. And there are actual invectives in Roe's journals about how this woman is, influencing the emperor, and he's under her spell. And that's why he isn't being reasonable about, letting these British merchants in, and these factors and traders do their thing. And then, of course, we know over time, within not from 1605, but from, say, around 1757, when we have the Battle of Plassey, things just completely turn around. And we see the British essentially having used their time-tested policy of divide and conquer to pit different parts of the Indian body politic against each other, and to, further their own ends of gaining political control, and of course thereby economic control. But it is something that is happening all over the world at this time with various European powers. And so this is what I mean when I say it's a world system, in the sense of a scholar like Emanuel Wallerstein, who first wrote about, world systems theories, that along with the slave trade and the rise of colonial aspirations all across Europe, we really see the world changing, and it changes completely for about 400 to 500 years, and gives us the world that we have now. And that is still a neo-colonial world. It's still, we are not out of the shadow of colonialism.
Absolutely. When it comes to the colonial era, the way I see it, I might be wrong, and you are welcome to correct me. I see that two very primary roles that women played, and women played from a space where they could change things, or they could, kind of influence or manipulate. One was the wife, and the other was the courtesan or the wife.
Mm-hmm.
How do you look at these two feminine equations with the men in terms of the changes that they may have caused to the economy with their demands, or just with their farsightedness, or the lack of it?
That's a really interesting question. I have to think a bit about that in terms of their financial impact or the roles that they played. I would say that it probably was relatively minimal. But in terms of just having a kind of sort of moral sway or immoral sway, for that matter, however you look at it, I don't see the courtesan as immoral. I see the courtesan as, supplying a need, and why not? I mean, everybody else does it. So, but in either case, I think that if we think about the sort of, again, behind the scenes kind of impact or influence these women may have had, they probably did have some in certain cases. But I also don't think that they, really significantly would have had anything to say about the actual, the real politic, the running of the economy, the creation again of laws that determine how the economy is run, because they were so rule bound. Like everything was, according to a law or according to a Hindu or a Muslim custom, and women had absolutely nothing to do with that. They were not consulted. They were simply, told, this is what you do. This is your place in life. And indeed, most other people did too. But as we know, women are always the repositories of, the virtue and the sanctity of a society. So they have this huge symbolic role to play and were very much burdened by that role. However, in my family or in my novel, In Love's Garden, I've tried to show how much power a woman could, in fact, gather, but it would definitely be a struggle. It would be, a woman of great strength of mind and force of character who would be able to defy some of the, well-entrenched norms that guided women's lives. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that is really how I see it. But in terms of the cultural impact of the courtesan, that's a whole other question. And again, there's been a lot of work done, scholarship done by, I believe her name is Veena Oldenburg, who wrote this very important book about courtesan culture in India and the kinds of self-fulfilled and highly culturally influential lives that many so-called wives, courtesans, ladies of pleasure had at a certain point in time. Again, with colonialism, with the British coming on the scene, these women's lives were degraded because they started to be seen as a kind of moral rot, and their cultural contributions to Indian culture were completely overlooked or dismissed. And then, as we know, eventually they kind of became these, women to satisfy the needs of the British Army, and were highly regulated, and their health was inspected on a regular basis. So they lost all the kind of cultural capital that they had, and simply became another part of keeping the empire in place, and particularly meeting the needs of men within that empire, and lost their autonomy in that sense.
True. My last question to you, Nandini, that every story or every novel, be it a short story, be it a long story, be it a full-fledged novel, end of the day talks a lot about the financial status and economy and the have-not space of the protagonists. How have you shown that aspect, or how has it come across? I'm sure that was not your core thought behind writing it. You were not trying to show the economic aspect, but then it must have come. So that is something that I would love to hear. That how do you think in your story socioeconomic strata from which the protagonist belongs impacts the story as a whole?
Well, I mean, if you're asking me about my novel in particular, it's really woven into the entire texture of the story. Just one example is that the wars are a big part of the way in which the lives of women are impacted in my novel, and those wars are really about money. I mean, every war is about money, and so women, even if they are, for instance, living in so-called in the sidelines, in the, within the sort of parda or within, the women's quarters, they're not unaffected by everything that happens outside of those quarters, especially with sort of, worldwide movements such as the two world wars or the Indian anti-colonial movement that occurred and that really a lot of women got involved in India, at least for a while, and then they were kind of sent home, almost in a sort of way as this happened to women in the West after the Second World War. They were brought onto the conflict, and then they were sent home. But money is really at the heart of things, even for the novel that I am trying to write right now. Not exactly so much in terms of money, but in terms of class. Class sensibilities impact people in ways that I think sometimes doesn't get as much attention as it should. I mean, we are creatures of the kind of, class system that we are within overall, and then our sense of our own familial identity, our personal legacy is deeply influenced by how we see ourselves as positioned vis-a-vis class. And Marx actually talked about class not as a concrete thing, but as a perception of one's relationship to other people in different classes or within the same class. So class is an issue of seeing oneself in the world in a certain way. And therefore, characters in fiction, largely can never escape that sort of stamp or that sort of proclivity or sensibility that they're born into as a result of being born into a certain class. And then, of course, when you add gender, we get the whole idea of the intersection of class and gender. And for women, they're always economically second-class citizens. Wherever you think about it, even in the United States, women are still making 82 cents to the dollar. I don't even want to ask what it is in India. Just don't want to think about it. I'm not automatically assuming it's worse, but I would be surprised if it were vastly better. So, so basically, money is a thing that I guess there is literature that, kind of sidesteps the issue, but I myself call myself a Marxist feminist, and so I can never see the world outside of, the structure, the framework that capitalism in particular, and then the money economy, but now also, of course, the kind of electronic fiscal economy has put us within. The other thing that I feel strongly about is global uneven development, and how the West remains sort of in a position of great power, despite the fact that supposedly the age of Western domination has ended with colonialism or imperialism. Of course, that is a myth. And what we continue to see is how the non-Western world, the global South, continues to be impacted by policies that the World Bank makes, the IMF makes, structural adjustment, this kind of thing. And so that's the kind of literature that really, really draws me. And just very recently, having seen the movie White Tiger, I had read White Tiger a long time ago, and I was very impressed by it then. But having seen the movie recently, reminded me of how powerful the discourse of class is, and how it penetrates to every aspect of either a person or a character's psychology. You can't think of a human being without thinking about the ways in which they are situated in the world vis-a-vis their, moolah, as you say, your term for this. So, yeah, I think that's a really, really big deal.
Nandini, I would request you that before we sign off formally, there would be a lot of people who would be watching. A lot of people are watching, and a lot of people who will be watching are from Insha's age group, which is the 11th, 12th to graduation, post-graduation levels. It is indeed a very difficult thing to weave the socio-cultural context in a story and bring out your activism without sounding like an activist. If there's any suggestion or any tip that you want to share, we would love to hear that.
So I think you're asking me, how can young women's and young people's political consciousness be stimulated and encouraged? And honestly, here, what I think is, particularly as someone who's both written scholarly work and is now, trying to write literary work, works of imaginative literature, I think works of imaginative literature have the greatest force and the greatest power to convey messages and also to create activist consciousness and sensibility. As in, I could write, I think, another 5 scholarly books, and yes, maybe a percentage of the reading population might read them. But I think I have a much bigger chance of, reaching out to people, to where they really are, to their hearts, their souls, by writing, humbly, as much as I can, the best of my ability, works of fiction. And I think that for this reason, I really think that the way we are losing a reading culture in the entire world, not just in one part of the world or another, is a real tragedy, because that is reading, and particularly immersing oneself in literature, in the arts, in culture, is one of the ways in which political sensibilities are nurtured. I mean, what did I care about what happened in China in the early 20th century? I mean, I didn't even know about much history about that when I was young. But when I read The Good Earth, or I read, work by Gorky, or I read, I'm trying to think of, even Dickens, like, Charles Dickens, when you read about the real human conditions of people who, have gone before you or who are in your world, through literature, the way that reaches out and touches you is priceless. And therefore, I think we really need to encourage even young activists to be familiar with literary work. And again, that example that I gave you about Arvind Adiga's novel, I mean, how powerful is that? I mean, that is the way in which I think everyone can become conscious of so much needing to be done, so much resistance to be made to the neoliberal world order. Tomes and tomes of academic writing aren't going to achieve that, in my opinion.
Absolutely.
I hope Insha agrees with me.
We do, and for Insha, she has a lot more to see, explore, observe, and learn. Yeah. So she is at an age which is very beautifully sheltered, but I'm afraid that this shelter will cease to exist. But thank you so much, Nandini. I really hope, and I urge to all who is watching or will watch, do read Nandini's books. Do pass your feedback to the author, because that is the most important and the most vital inspiration that you can offer, the most wonderful way to reach out to the author and tell them what you felt, because that inspires us to write more. Do reach out with Nandini's books also. Do read Love's Garden.
And let me just put a plug in about Coral's book, AHALYA, which I now have a copy of. And it already looks amazing. I've just started. Please read that and, support us writers. We need your help. We need your encouragement. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Insha.
Insha?
Yeah, thanks everyone for attending to Money Talks with Nandini Bhattacharya. This talk series is in sync with the invitation for Money Stories and also for the writing program, a 6 weeks workshop with ladies first as the story prompt. Please visit www.tellmeyourstory.biz for more. Thank you and good night.